Thank you for being so prompt. We're going to wait just for maybe a couple of minutes till the crowd builds up, and then we can get started. But it's nice. It's nice to see people logging in on time. It always feels good. I see some familiar names there. These are the people joining us from all over India, I see.
Yeah, where is everyone? Where's everyone located? Curious.
Yeah, go ahead and put your location in the chat.
Yeah, can attendees put type in the chat?
Yeah, I think that chat is open.
Okay.
Also put it in the Q&A box if you feel like the chat is not open for you. I mean, Saturday evening, everybody who's here is definitely interested in the topic. So this is good. It's good to get a crowd on a Saturday evening.
Yeah, maybe they can't type actually. You write that.
Someone did type in the Q&A box.
Okay, perfect. UK, nice.
Yeah. All right. So this session is getting recorded. So I think we can just go ahead and start, and then people miss sessions. If people miss the beginning, then they can just join in. Welcome, everyone. Have a really good evening to each and every one of you. The Red Pen is here to talk to you about cracking the world of finance and consulting today. And we have an expert in the house to talk to you directly. Stephen actually comes from MBB, which is McKinsey, Bain, BCG, the world of MBB. And it's really, really important for us to have this conversation at this juncture with you, who's currently in college or a recent grad from a college and are looking at the world of finance and consulting, because we often underestimate the importance of building the right skill set and building the right connections to actually be able to crack the recruitment opportunities that will come your way. And it's very nuanced. Of course, it's competitive. There are too many people applying for the same stuff. There's also geopolitics involved. But there are also very specific nuances which come in the world of consulting and financial consulting. And that's what Stephen is here to crack open for us today. He's kind of come up with an agenda. We did discuss it earlier when we met. And it's going to be a four-step scaffolding that he's going to present to you. Stephen, that's on the next slide, the agenda for the audience today. So he's going to take you through these. And as he's talking to you, you're going to have a lot of questions in your mind. Go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. I promise you, we're not going to let Stephen leave until he answers each and every question that you have. Put it in the box. If something's unclear, ask him to clarify it for you, and he'll definitely do it again. And then, of course, later on, if you need to, you can always get in touch with him. I'm sure he'll share his details with you, or even on LinkedIn. He's super, super good with getting back and being communicative. So on that note, Stephen, welcome and thank you. And we're really looking forward to what you have to share with us today. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tripti. And thank you so much, guys, for kind of excited to see everyone. So this is a bit, I think you guys can't message in the chat, which is totally fine. But I actually am curious who's in the room. So in the Q&A, it's totally a bad usage of Q&A feature, but could you guys just put in there what year you are right now? And if that you could just say, freshman in university, post-grad, high school senior, whatever. I'm just curious. I'm going to talk a little bit about the some timing stuff and kind of what you need in order to get into. I talk about both investment banking and consulting as well. But if you could just go into the Q&A and then just throw that in, that'd be super useful for me to get a sense of who's in the room. Okay, awesome. Gabriel Junior University. Awesome. Okay. Anyone else? Second year uni. Cool. Okay. Great. So we're gonna talk a bit about sophomore uni. Awesome. And that means that your sophomore year, I guess, means you're rising. Um, okay. Okay. Um, Excellent. Well, we're gonna talk
Stephen,
about
the
a couple.
chat is on actually. People are able to put it in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Oh yeah, just throw it in the chat actually. That's easier. Masters in management. Okay, awesome. Awesome. Um, okay, excellent. So we're gonna talk a little bit about investment banking and consulting. Uh, just to quickly reintroduce myself. So I'm Stephen. I'm one of the co-founders of, okay, we got sophomores. Emory this year, freshman year. Let's go. Nice. Cool. So I'm Stephen. Just a quick background on myself, like Tripti mentioned. So I grew up kind of in and out of the US and Asia as a kid, lived in Singapore and Hong Kong. My dad's a professor. To be honest, I had this like really awesome family and a really great educational environment, but I knew nothing about things like investment banking and consulting. When I was at Harvard's undergrad, it really opened my eyes to what was possible. And one of the big unlocks that I had was my freshman year. I was doing okay in school, but I didn't really know what to do in terms of recruiting. And then sophomore year, I had this friend of mine who was an upperclassman who kind of took me aside, and he was working at McKinsey or was going to work at McKinsey next year. And he's like, dude, Steven, like you're doing well, but you're kind of not doing any of the things you need to do if you want to get one of these jobs. And I know a lot of probably families here are like business families or maybe engineers, whatever. Like when I lived in Bombay for 2 years, just to say the broad group that I saw a lot of in Bombay. And you may not have as much context for like what is the process for investment banking or consulting look like. Certainly that was the case for me in college. And so this mentor of mine really took me aside and said, hey, like here's the things that you need to do if you want to get one of these jobs. So eventually I ended up recruiting, got the offer at McKinsey, also did investment banking stuff. My co-founder Dhruva worked at a hedge fund, Bridgewater, for a bit as well. And over the past 5 years, we've run a research program, really a set of programs called Lumiere. We've had over 5,000 students do research with us. And we've started over the past year working with students as they're navigating, thinking about careers. These are early our alums in consulting and finance, where if you want to be successful in them, you really need to be thinking ahead. And you need to be quite strategic in terms of the things that you do in order to stand out. So that's the high level. The career program is kind of this individual program. I'll talk mainly about investment banking, but just a high level of that, it's like we're just a career training program. We work with dozens of students in the same way that the Red Pen helps students think about their next steps for university or grad school. We help students think about landing jobs at places like Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, et cetera. And that's essentially where we kind of come from as well. So let's just talk a little bit about, could you guys, by the way, throw in the chat? I'm also curious, are you more interested in investment banking, finance, or are you more interested in consulting? And we could talk about both. So investment banking, just at a high level, I always found like these were broad terms that I kind of abstractly heard, but really didn't know what they were. You can think of investment bankers, and if you think about finance broadly, finance is just, money transfer, et cetera. Investment banking is kind of like the super sexy real estate agents or realtors of finance. They do a bunch of different stuff. They raise capital by issuing stocks and bonds. They help out with M&A. They give financial advice for complex transactions. They're essentially like a intermediary between companies, other investors. They're pushing deals forward. They're bringing things to people who are trying to buy equities, buy bonds, et cetera. You can really think of them as kind of like the middleman of most big financial transactions. They're going to be investment bankers usually on both sides or many sides of a transaction. So investment bankers are really deep in the process of finance in general. Investment banking is also really important, I would say, because it is, and we'll talk a bit about why students do it, but it is one of the most difficult types of industries to get into, but it has really good exit opportunities in terms of the next things that you could do, whether it's joining a hedge fund, joining a private equity firm, continuing an investment bank, going to business school, starting your own company, whatever it might be. Essentially, it's one of, if not the highest compensated fields in the world. And for that reason, it's extremely hard to get in. Now, just talk a little bit about consulting on the other hand. So investment banks, think about them as these are the people who are in between transactions, whether it's transactions between firms who mergers and acquisitions, whether it's a company who's trying to change how they structure themselves in something called restructuring, issuing bonds, whatever. Anytime this kind of financial maneuvering is happening, they're in the middle. Consulting is where you're making strategic decisions for the company, and then you have a group of people like at McKinsey, they're kind of called the CEO whisperers, because very, very literally they're working with the CEOs, usually on making large scale strategic decisions. So for example, when I was working at McKinsey, I was working on a fashion brand from the US and their China entry strategy. How could they expand? The goal is for them to 10x over the next 3 years in China and to enter into the market. So this is the type of question that's at the CEO level. Consultants are then working at those questions, breaking them down and thinking about, hey, what could we do in order to achieve that strategy? Exit opportunities for consulting is similar in some ways to investment banking, usually a little bit less financial. So you could go to private equity or hedge funds. That's kind of the overlap. Consultants also often go to business school. They also often start their own companies. Like my team members at McKinsey, most of them ended up starting their own companies afterwards. That's what I did. And they also go into things like public policy, public sector. It's a little bit more broad, I'd say, in the types of things. I am curious, if you could throw in the chat, I don't know if we have a, oh, yeah, perfect. Can you throw in the chat? I'm curious, like for people who are listening, like, are you more excited by investment banking finance or by consulting or something else? Just throw in the chat. I'd love to just see a little bit of what people are thinking about. So just why, again, are people looking at, and it doesn't be Ivy League students, actually, it's more than half of any class investment banking comes from non-Ivy. So really, so consulting. Okay, excellent. Cool. I guess we got like consulting. Great. So everything here, I'm going to talk particularly about investment banking because the process is a little bit earlier, and then everything consulting similar, just like a 6-month time delay. So for these investment banks, students are usually doing it because it's both high prestige, high pay, and there's really good exit opportunities. It really opens up the aperture of what you can do after graduation. There are also firms, for those looking at the US, who sponsor. So if you're looking at the bulge brackets or MBB top consulting firms, the very top will sponsor national students. They really don't care where you come from. They're looking for the very best students. If you go a few tiers below, then it's kind of up in the air whether or not they'll sponsor or not. Let's talk a little bit about comp, because I think this is like kind of I think talking about money is something that people should talk about. It's kind of like this weird non-transparent thing. These numbers are actually a little bit old, but essentially the way to think about it is if you get a role in an investment bank, you'll be making somewhere between the first year $150,000 to $250,000. That's relatively, $130,000 to $250,000, relatively standard. The most common path for someone who joins an investment bank, and this is actually not so dissimilar from consulting as well, is that you would work in the investment bank for a few years, and then you would usually transition to what's called the buy side. And the buy side it's called that because people are buying equities. So you're a private equity firm, you're actually acquiring companies or acquiring large stakes in companies, or you're in a hedge fund where you're essentially taking positions in what could be called like public stocks, something like called public equities, or do a quantitative hedge fund, whatever it might be. There's lots of different ways for you to do it, or different types of hedge funds. But very quickly, just the quick high level is that most people who are like really optimizing for money will work in investment bank for a few years and then move to the buy side. And then in hedge funds, you could be making, these numbers I think are honestly really low. You could be making quickly in like the low millions within 4 to 5 years. I have a friend who, because you also get a lot of carry, who's 10 years out or some 8 years out. He just made $20 million last year because of essentially an investment that he made for a large hedge fund that he works for. So they're very lucrative. Now, consulting is similar. It actually starts at roughly the same range. Consulting doesn't grow quite as fast, but within 7-8 years, if you're based in the US, and you're like at the partner level, then you're usually making high 6 digits, oftentimes low 7 digits. And if you're a partner, senior partner at McKinsey, then you're usually making between $1 to $4 million per year. So anyways, these roles, most people in the consulting side will leave after a few years and then do something else. But just the high level of like why these firms can unlock quite a bit for you is if you get into them, which is quite difficult, they can really unlock a career that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. And so for me, by the way, the way I think about this is I think that a lot of people are doing a disservice to college graduates by saying things like, hey, you're going to switch careers 7 times in your life. You should enjoy college, enjoy the time you have. You should really be exploring. I think there's truth to that. But the reality is that the first job you get is extremely impactful. There's a lot of research around this, extremely impactful for your long-term earning potential. And for the learnings that you have as well, which you might apply, especially if you go back and say work in the family business or something. So, we'll talk a bit about like what these firms need for you to get into them, but it's not the kind of thing actually where you can be like really chill about it. You actually have to be quite intentional. And so I do think a lot of students, like myself included, really kind of got lulled into complacency in like the first or second year because you're told, just explore, have fun. But if you want to get into one of these careers, which can be quite impactful for your life and also your ability to make impact in the world, then it's actually something where I think you need to be quite intentional quite early on. Of course, if you don't want to do it, then you don't need to do that. But if this is something you care about, you can do it. So examples of investment banks for things like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, you may have heard of them, Morgan Stanley. Hedge funds are a little bit like more like, who are these guys? But you may have heard of firms like Bridgewater, Citadel. These guys manage hundreds of billions of dollars. The ratio of people to managing money is ridiculous. These hedge funds, you might have 5 people managing $1 billion. It's just insane. And then private equity firms, again, private equity hedge funds are a little bit like, I don't really understand them when I was in college, but because you private equity firms just also amass a bunch of money and they take more active positions usually in the companies that they own, like Blackstone, KKR, Bain Capital. I was at a Harvard reunion recently, and this is 2 days ago, and I was talking to a guy who worked at Bain Capital, and he was like, yeah, we try to invest in Asia, but we can only invest $500 million or up. And I was like, oh my God, that's crazy. So that's just the scale of these companies to give you a sense, especially if you're in the top tier bracket. So that's a little bit about like the why of investment banking, why of consulting. The reality is that these firms are extremely selective in terms of who they bring on. They're labor intensive. They're essentially looking for really, really talented people, particularly at that lower level. And they're as competitive as universities. And you can come from pretty much any university and get into these firms. Of course, they have target firms. And so if you go to one of these target companies, whether it's especially in the US, say like one of the top 20 schools in the US or a large public school, you have a higher chance, but it's still very competitive, regardless of university that you go to. So it's somewhere in the order of 1 to 2% of people who apply ultimately get offers at these firms. But if you do it intentionally, just like college, like what I've observed and I've seen time and time again is that people who have a strategy tend to do much better. And students we've worked with that I've seen get 3, 4, 5 offers, whereas most students don't get interviews. So there's kind of the rich get richer type of thing. Not necessarily money wise, but just in terms of like the students who are really well prepared, are networked in, have the right backgrounds, and to prepare themselves tend to just do way better than other students in terms of getting these jobs. So I see a question about sponsor MBA. So good question. Absolutely. Most of these firms will sponsor MBA if you're looking at the top group. So for example, McKinsey sponsors, MBB sponsors, a lot of these investment banks sponsor as well. The most common for investment banks, by the way, actually, is that you would do that. You would then get your investment bank, your private equity or hedge fund offer, and then sometimes the private equity hedge fund might be the one who sponsors. So you go through that. But in any case, potentially making more than enough to pay as well. But yeah, sponsorship is very common as well for these firms. So talk a little bit about IB recruiting. I'll also talk about consulting. For IB recruiting, I'm just going to say talk about IB recruiting, but consulting is essentially 6 months later in timeline, but also very aggressive because they compete on talent. The one thing to note is that you are getting a lot of your offers for your internships by your sophomore year, for your junior summer. It's a junior to senior year, and then if you're going for a full-time cycle, that happens really early, your junior or your senior year. So it happens in your junior summer and senior year. So there's kind of two windows. The most common thing I'd say, and this is the big thing I want to hopefully help you guys avoid today, is to just don't miss the timeline. Because the biggest thing is that most people just like, for example, if I didn't have this mentor, I totally would have just missed the timeline. I had no idea it was so early. And so if you don't know, then you're kind of screwed in terms of getting these offers. The reality is that you need a couple of different things to get these offers, particularly for the top firms. The biggest one that most people lack is a network. Usually you need to be referred in to these companies to get an interview for it to be likely for you to get an interview, particularly in investment banking. But there's also some truth to that in consulting. You need to know really clearly what you're going to do in the interview in terms of technical interviews. In the case of consulting, it's called case consulting or case interviews. And then you need a strategy in order for you to position yourself well to do it. And you can be successful starting like your sophomore or junior year, but ideally you can start as early as possible in order for you to be successful into getting one of these jobs. So what do investment banks look for? I'll talk about how this is similar and different for consulting. Investment banks are looking for students to do well in school. You're looking at least for a 3.7. It can be a little bit lower potentially if you have relevant experience, but ideally that 3.8, 4.0. You usually need to have some set of experiences that signal you're interested in finance and this is for finance, you really need to have finance related experiences usually. For consulting, it's a little bit more broad ended. So they're looking kind of like it's a little bit more like college. They're looking for more interesting people, if you will. And then with relevant business experience, but not necessarily consulting experience. Finance is more looking for people in finance. Ideally, you've shown leadership and you need to be able to do really well in terms of these technical interviews for finance. And there's just a set of things you need to learn that are pretty laid out and clear, that if you learn these things, you can usually do well in the interview. But if you don't know to do them, then it's going to be tough for you to get past the first or second round. Consulting is similar, I would say, for MBB, the top, very similar, 3.7 up, usually 3.8 to 4. You need to have done interesting things over your summer. Ideally, you're working at firms that are well-known or recognized, at least for your sophomore summer for consulting. And then consulting firms look more for things like leadership in your school. So if you're like the student body president or you're head of a newspaper, that's going to help you out more than it would be for finance and consulting. And then instead of technical interviews, it's more called the case interview method, which is a structured thinking, which is something you can practice and get better at. But if you haven't practiced it, you're like, I did like 30, 40 interviews before my interviews with McKinsey. And then, I think that's the reason why I was able to land it, because you have to really just practice for you to be potentially successful. And I just want to say the recruiting moves fast. That's one thing I think that, so I see a question, if I want to do an MBA later, should I aim to do IB or consulting? I don't think it matters. Both of these types of firms can sponsor an MBA. But both could sponsor an MBA. I think that they're both easy paths to do it. The way I would think about it is, which am I more maybe interested in? And you can always go from finance to consulting, but you can't go from consulting to finance, because finance is more specific. It's also earlier, as I'll show right now. And so if you want to be competitive for if you want to get into finance, you have to just make that decision first. And you can always go, like one of our leaders for Ladder worked at JP Morgan, and then she ended up moving, so Morgan Stanley, excuse me, and then ended up moving to McKinsey after. She was my team member at McKinsey. So you can make that move, but you can't make the move the other way, just so you know. So recruiting is really fast. So if I saw some people kind of at different stages, second year uni. So if you're at sophomore year uni right now, you are like in the midst of it. I'm assuming you're you are like entering into your sophomore summer. So winter and spring interviews and offers are made for the following year. If you're looking at consulting, they actually happen right in the next, let's say, June through September. So they happen the next 4 months for sophomore year. If you're about to enter into university, that means that you're essentially, on the moment upon entering, you'll find out your junior summer within 18 months of starting. So it's super fast. The junior summer matters a lot because, particularly for finance and also for consulting, if you get that summer offer, 80% of the time, it will lead to a full-time offer. So that's the summer you want to be hustling towards because it can lead to your full-time offer. There's another cycle, your senior fall. For investment banking, it's a bit harder to get in, but for consulting, that's a big cycle. So if you're a sophomore right now, you're thinking about consulting, you can also, it's another window, which is between essentially July and November of your senior year, where you can also recruit for the top consulting firms as well. But just to say, this is a very fast-paced environment, and you actually need to be quite intentional if you want to be competitive when thinking about these firms. So just an example, like what an example timeline could look like for someone. And if you're already a sophomore, you can think about, like for me, I really started thinking about this sophomore year. So you can definitely catch up, but it's you need to be then really intentional about it. So this is for the investment banking. Consulting is a little bit slower, but very similar. Freshman year, you need to be doing well in school. You need to begin entering into clubs. You need to start networking, usually that freshman summer, so you know people who can then refer you in. You also need to start getting some of those base prep in, whether it's the case interview or it's technicals for banking. You're applying for sophomore summer opportunities, usually 12 months in advance, could be 6 months in advance. And then similarly applying for junior opportunities. The weird thing about this timeline, it's moved up so early because banks compete with each other for talent that oftentimes you get your junior opportunity before you get your sophomore one. So it's a bit of weirdness there. Ideally, you secure your junior or summer offer sometime in March of your sophomore year, but it can be later, it can be earlier. And then you go on and do your junior summer, and that should lead to a full-time offer. Another recruiting cycle then happens your senior fall. So that's another one if you're thinking about that. If you're a master's student, I know Siddhan mentioned that as well, then the cycle is kind of similar, but you would be thinking about the first year of your master's, of a 2 years master's, that'd be when you do the recruiting. And that's when you get the internship, which then leads. Okay, this is just a little bit about us. I won't say too much about it, but essentially we work with you throughout the whole process to make sure that you're doing everything you need to do to be strategic in that process, and then also get connected to the companies, land the internships you need, and then ultimately get the interview and then get the job. And so we essentially work with you pretty closely on that. So just to say a little bit about what the top candidates do differently, and I've observed this a few times, and there really is a way to crack this. The best candidates end up getting 3, 4, 5 offers, and most people don't get any offers. And so the difference is pretty clear and high impact. I'd say the biggest is that the top candidates end up knowing people at every firm they're targeting because they're very intentional about building that network. And there's really specific strategies you can take in order to build that network, starting freshman year, reaching out to people, getting warm referrals in, joining the right clubs, doing these kind of like preview weekends where you can get to know the firms. The best candidates understand the differences between each firm. How is Goldman Sachs different than Morgan Stanley, different than Bank of America? All of these things are really deep in. And then they also have the technical background. They spend in the time at least 50 hours, up to 100 hours spent on building up the technical skills to be competitive. And then they are intentional about building up early experiences that reflect their interest. So whether that's working at a boutique bank, whether it's working in fintech, business development roles, et cetera, they're building up that proof points early on, their first or second years, to then show when they're applying for them, say, hey, I actually really care about this thing. I'm interested in it. And for both investment banking and consulting, they're looking for people who want to be in it, particularly for investment banking. So you need to be able to speak the language. And the top candidates already feel like they've been working in investment bank for a few years. And usually it's because they're getting prep from some group like us, or they're part of a really good club that's helping support them, or they have a family member who's in finance who's supporting them through it. So the top candidates usually have some type of unfair advantage, I'd say, or they realized they were interested in it very early on. So you want to make sure that you are able to do that by meeting people at these firms, knowing what they're about, and then getting the early experiences to make sure you're competitive. I won't say too much about this. This is just us. We're essentially a group of people who have gotten offers at investment banks, MBB, et cetera, hedge funds. And the programs themselves are all focused on helping you, very individual, and then getting the final offer. So it's all one-on-one. You're working with people who already have gotten the offers at places like McKinsey or BCG Bain, or on the investment banking side, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, et cetera. So that's essentially it. I thought it'd be more interesting, though, if we spent more time actually talking. If you guys have questions about your own specific experience, what you're thinking about. We're not a very big group, so it's great. So we can go, I think, pretty detailed into your own experience. If this is interesting, we have an interest form. You just need to scan the QR code, and then if we think you're a fit in terms of your background, we'll reach out. Not everyone is, and so we're a little bit selective in terms of who we actually bring on to the program, because it's hard to get these roles, and we only want to work with people who we think have a shot. But if you're ambitious and you think it's something you're excited by, whether it's consulting or banking, you can fill it out, and then we'll reach out to you for a call. Perfect. I think I'm going to transition to talk a little bit about Tripti, open up for questions for people as they're thinking about it.
Yep, and I think there are a couple of questions already that we can start with, Stephen, in the box. So someone's talking about sponsoring MBA if you join as an undergrad and work for a few years. Do they sponsor your MBA if you join as an undergrad and work for a few years?
So both investment banks and consulting firms do sponsor MBA. Again, this is at for investment banks. For consulting, it's called MBB, McKinsey, Bain, BCG. For investment banks, it's called the bulge brackets, which are these large investment banks that work with the largest companies. Both of those will often sponsor MBAs. That's very common. And it's a good strategy if you want to do an MBA, but you also don't want to pay, say you want to go to the US, $200K to go do an MBA. So for sure.
Stephen, I have a follow-up question on that. If you don't mind answering that for the audience. Is there an unfair advantage that maybe a grad school student will have in the recruitment process? Is it a trend that an undergrad student may not be as popular in the recruitment process versus, say, a grad student? Or are they recruiting for different positions? Can you put that in perspective a little bit, considering we have a mixed audience?
Yeah. So it depends a little bit on the grad school or the grad program. If you're doing a MSc, for example, then usually you're considered in the undergrad recruitment cycle. So we have a few master's students who are working with us who are looking at things like hedge funds. They're recruiting, they're doing a master's, a master's in analytics or something. So they would be considered usually in the same group as the undergrads. They have the advantage that usually they have a better profile and experience in undergrads. They have the disadvantage that they usually have less time in order to then get the interview. So for the 2-year program, it's quite fast. But certainly McKinsey, for example, does recruit a lot of master's students. And there is because particularly for consulting, but also investment banks, there are these target universities. If you're coming from a non-target, one way to try to break in is to go to a master's program at a target university, and then you kind of enter into the pool of potential candidates. I do think that's a reasonable strategy, a decent strategy to take if you're kind of in that position.
That's
for
fair.
MBAs, it's a different cycle actually. MBAs, then you're considered an MBA student. And then I think that is actually easier. If you're coming from like one of the top 7 MBA programs, it's easier to then get a role at these banks and consulting than from undergrad.
Yeah, but like getting into an M7 with like 5-year average, 6 years average work experience is just
No,
hardcore.
that's not.
So, Siddhant wants to know about getting referred for strategy consulting. What are you going to say about that?
Um, yeah, so I think the referral strategy is you need to know people at these firms. And, of course, that's like, the question you would ask is like, well, how do I get to know these people? There's 3 main strategies to do that. So the first strategy is using existing network that you may have, or that's kind of like latent, like underneath the surface for you. That could be your school, that could be your high school, that could be friends and family. That's one that can certainly be useful for some people, not for everyone. For me, I didn't have that, so that wasn't a strategy I could take. The second is that you can join communities that are pipelines for these organizations. So at every school, like I know this question about Emory. Emory, by the way, is it's called a semi-target. Gets a lot of students into investment banking and into consulting. But within a school like Emory, there will be a consulting and a finance club, and they will be sending 80% of their alums to these firms. And so getting into these sub communities, even at a place like Harvard, like the consulting club is the club that really owns most of the offers. So then you want to think about, okay, well, I can't necessarily get directly to McKinsey, but I can get into this consulting club, which will then unlock a lot of this network for me. And then the third strategy is doing a cold outreach. And that's actually pretty effective. If you do the right thing, if you present yourself well and you show that you're genuinely interested, people are in general pretty bad, I think, about doing this type of cold outreach. So we do a lot of time, at least in the career program, teaching you how to do that and then helping you actually do it and giving you data to then reach out to people. That's another strategy. So those are the 3 main strategies that people take, depending on your position.
Okay. Yeah, I think that just makes complete sense. Okay, so someone's put in 3 questions. I'm just going to go one after the other. How easy or difficult is it to start at an office in a country I'm not studying in? Example, if I'm studying at Oxbridge, but starting in the US or Middle East.
So it's a good question. And by the way, offices for consulting is something you can do, and also for investment banking to try to game a little bit to make your chances higher of getting in. I think you need to have some connection to the region for it to be reasonable for you to apply if you're not studying there. So if you are like, for example, when I was working at McKinsey, I worked in the Boston office, I also worked in the Beijing office. So for like Chinese students, it's actually true for Indian as well. They do recruit from top US or UK universities, but you have to be Chinese. Like I actually tried to recruit for Chinese offices. I speak Chinese. I went to high school in Taipei. But for me, they're like, dude, why is this like white American guy trying to get into the Shanghai office? Doesn't make sense. They're like, you should go for the Boston office. So if you have family, let's say if you're at Oxford, it's gonna be very difficult for you to go to the US. Almost impossible, to be honest, unless you're American. You could look at the Middle East, that's a bit easier, and that's a decent funnel. You could look at like Dubai or Riyadh, and then you'd have to make some type of argument for why it's reasonable for you to do it. And then consulting is networking. It really does matter, whether it's in the US or outside the US, the network does matter quite a bit for you to get the first interview. And 95% of people don't even get the first interview. And that's because their background is just like good, but it's similar to everyone else, especially as for Indian candidates. I observe this a lot. And so you need to be able to, in order to stand above, you usually need to have that network for you to get the first interview. And then you can get into consulting after a DPhil, certainly. But if that's the case, I don't know if I would consider doing it. If you're trying to get into consulting, I don't know if a DPhil is like, it's not the most obvious path to get into consulting. You could just go from undergrad or from master's.
Yep. All right. And then do you offer mentorship for asset management roles or any other domain in finance besides IB and consulting?
Absolutely. So people within finance, I'd say about half are going for investment banking. The other half are going for things like asset management. We also have people who are looking at the buy side as well. So very common: private equity, hedge funds. But asset management's a big one, and it's a great one. We have, I think, yeah, 20% of our students are doing asset management. So that's something that you're excited by. That's certainly something that we support students doing. It's a bit easier, by the way. Asset management's
Yes.
nice because it's a bit less competitive than investment banking. So it's a bit easier to get roles in these firms as well. They're still quite difficult.
Stephen, can you help shed some light on, because you mentioned that freshman year you should start, or even like master students who are just going in. A lot of them foundationally are super strong in their quant skills, whether it's econometrics or statistics or even math, calculus, etc. So often they'll come to me with a question, say, for example, like, I don't really know whether I should like do my strengths lie in asset management or is it in investment banking? Am I looking at buy side? Am I looking at sell? There is a little bit of lack of clarity, especially from a cohort that is foundationally strong, Stephen,
Yeah.
in the world of, say, financial consulting. Any advice on how one would pick one over the other? Is it entirely interest focused, or is it about just being at the right place at the right time?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit like the type of work that you enjoy. So for like wealth management or asset management, it's actually a very relationship based role. So you have to really enjoy both the finance side, but also enjoy like talking to people, being able to connect with them, relate to them. It's a highly relationship driven role. Um, if you are because you're managing this person's assets, usually like high net worth individuals or institutions. Um, if you really love like the technical and you like that super fast paced environment, like doing something on a deadline, investment banking can be really good because it's pretty high intensity, but it can be both quite technically interesting in terms of like the models that you're building, but also you're especially later on, but you're also kind of like doing these deals in real time. And then if you're really interested in like the technical aspect of this, then I would consider just going straight to the buy side and thinking about things like quantitative hedge funds, hedge fund, like, these type of like analyst roles. That's usually a better fit. But what I'd encourage is that it's very hard to know this on the outside because it's so niche. So you need to be talking to people in it and just get a sense of like who these people are. Like, do I like when I talk to someone who works at a quant firm versus someone who works in investment bank versus someone who works in asset management? Like, these are the types of things I think that you need to do. Ideally, your first or second year, or first two, few months before you recruit, so you can be specific about why it's that thing that you're going for.
Got it. Got it. Thank you for that. Okay, moving on to the regular question bank.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on Emory for breaking into finance and investment banking? I think you mentioned about investment banking at
Yeah, so I
Emory
have a
earlier.
student right now at Emory who's working with us, who's a 4.0 at Emory. Um, she is she's great. She's also an international student. Um, and I think Emory is a good school for you to do it if you are doing well in so Emory is what's called a semi-target. That means that every year they take people at all the top, usually the top bulge bracket investment banks, also for consulting. But it also means that you need to really stand out inside that. So that means that you probably need to be involved in the clubs in order for you to be kind of networked in, and you need to be doing really well from a GPA perspective as well. So that's true of all schools, but it's particularly true for what we call like a semi-target. So I think it's a great pathway, and we help out. I would say about half of our students come from like semi-target or non-target schools to get roles, and you can certainly do it. I don't think if anyone tells you you can't, that's not true. But you do have to work, I think, harder, and you have to be more specific about the network building piece. So ideally, you're getting warm referrals in order for you to be competitive, because you have to stand out within like a broader pool as well. And there's going to be fewer recruiters who are like dedicated to your university.
Got it. All right. And what's your opinion on coffee chats and fireside chats that are organized by these consulting clubs and societies?
Yeah, I think they're important. So this is something that I've now observed a lot of times, that these getting into these consulting or finance clubs are important inputs for you to then ultimately get the job. So it's not necessary, but it's if you do it, you're much more likely to get it. So these coffee chats are can be valuable, and I'd certainly do it. I would consider also trying to figure out who's the person making the decision in these consulting clubs. So talk directly to the president. Usually, if you just email them or reach out, hey, I'm really interested. Would you like to chat with me? You know, 2 times out of 3 they'll say yes, especially if you kind of come across as compelling and interested, you're interested in them as a person. So certainly I think the coffee chats matter. Remember, the coffee chats are open. So at Ladder Careers, we think about front doors and side doors. Front doors are the doors that are open to everyone. They're obvious. They're something that you can find online or direct. Front doors are almost always highly competitive because they're obvious, they're clear, and they lead to an outcome that people want. So that's dangerous, right? Front doors, I actually like, it's okay to go through a front door, but just know there's gonna be a lot of people trying to squeeze with you through that door. Side doors are doors that are usually not as easy to observe. So they're roles that aren't on the public website. They're ways to get an interview that are not from just throwing your resume into a pile. And they're much more effective for getting in. They're effective because they're not very well known. Once they get well known, they become a front door and they become competitive again. So just always think about, if I'm doing something, is this a front door? Is this a side door? If it's something that's very publicly shared, it's a front door. So these coffee chats are front doors because they're saying, hey, we do coffee chats. So everyone's going to do it. So you have to do it. But it's not going to make you distinguished because now it's an obvious thing to do. So you have to be quite strategic when you're thinking about this type of stuff. But just be a little careful. Like, that's a front door, so do it. But you also should think about side doors to get into these consulting clubs as well.
Got it. Got it. All right. And when you mentioned about the transition from UK to the US being relatively hard, what about vice versa? You think going from, say, a US university to a UK consulting company, etc., would be easy? Or do you still think the nationality thing stands?
So I think it's hard, unless you are from that country, for you to create a compelling reason why you're trying to go to that office. Because the office wants to keep you for 5-10 years, ideally, even though, of course, you may not do it. So if you are, let's say you're Indian and you're an Indian passport holder and you're studying in the US, it's just going to be very hard for you to make a compelling reason for why you want to be in the London office, unless you study abroad there or something. You'd have to give some reason for that. That said, once you enter into one of these firms, they're very global. It's very easy to then transfer within one. Like, that's what I did. I was in the Boston office for a year, then I transferred to the China office. So once you're in the club, you can move around. So my strategy, my approach for you would be try to get in wherever you can, and then look up, and then you can make a geographic decision after that. But don't try to optimize too many things at once where you're like, I want this firm and this office, and I'm not even there. That's going to be quite difficult for you to be successful.
Yeah. I think the next question you've kind of answered in many other ways, but like, if you had to just go directly, can someone who works at an MBB refer you to another office, like in another economy?
Yeah, they can. They can. It may not be as like, the ideal thing is that you have the person referring who's working with the recruiter to do like on-campus recruiting. That's like the ideal process. But any reference helps. Particularly for Bain, which is very reference driven. It's kind of the most bro-y of the firms, actually, if you will. And so it's highly network driven. So yeah, I mean, I think that helps. It would be helpful. It would not be as helpful as having someone in the US refer you, and that would not be as helpful as someone in that specific office that you're applying to refer you. So ideally, Siddhant, for you, you should use that friend as one source, but then you would ideally build up other connections as well over the next like 6-12 months, whatever it is, who would then refer you into the different offices as well. So that's your current resource set, but don't be like, don't be constrained by that. If you want to be successful, you have to think about what other resources you can kind of grab to then support you in the process.
So you're saying this is one side door and they should find some couple of others as well. Just keep
Exactly. Yeah.
opening.
Totally. Make sure you're thinking about the other side doors.
Because this is kind of different from what we recommend for masters for graduate schools. Like, just because you know a professor who visited a campus and taught there does not mean that you ask them for a recommendation. It doesn't really work. You rather, so it's the opposite advice of what we give for grad school. But this is interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It matters more, I
Okay.
think.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, totally. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, someone asked, how does one build a good network? And I do think that's a very broad question. So can we just like put a pin on this one and come back to it later if we have time? Because we have other questions as well.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's a good one to go to more specific ones.
Yeah, so book which you recommend for networking, we'll come back to. Manju wants to know, how easy is it to switch from marketing and brand strategy roles to consulting?
So, oh, I should add a slide on this. Uh, so, okay, the one reason why this is actually a little bit higher stakes than even like I claimed at the very beginning is because if you're interested in these things, they only have a few entry points. So that's the weird thing. They only have a few entry points. So for investment banking consult, let's say consulting, you you really it's very difficult to enter unless you enter as an undergrad, either in your junior summer or your senior fall, or you enter in a master's, post-master's. It's very hard for especially like MBB for you to do something and then horizontally move into consulting. Very difficult and quite rare. It's not impossible, but quite rare. So it is it's not easy, is the short answer, actually, because if you're doing marketing brand strategy, you're already not doing consulting. And that means you haven't entered into the path line. Now, if you're doing it currently and you're really interested in consulting, you can definitely still do it. Unless you're going to go to a master's program, it's actually still possible for you to do it at that point. So you can just have another, like one of those like pivot points. Or you can get like super deep into it, start talking to people there. So it's possible, but it's just more difficult. So it's much easier to go from consulting to marketing brand strategy than from marketing brand strategy to consulting.
Got it. And if you, Manjari, are somebody who's got like less than 2 years of work experience, you would look at a master's in management to make that pivot. Top business schools offering it. But if you have more than just 2.5, 3 years of work experience, consider an MBA to do the same. All right. Then there's someone who worked in McKinsey. So as someone who worked in McKinsey, Stephen, they want to know how intense are the hours? And would you say McKinsey workload is more intense than compared to, say, BCG or Bain or other top boutique firms?
Um, I think they're very similar, McKinsey, Bain, and BCG in terms of like hours. And they're getting better, honestly, because they're trying to retain people. The one of the bigger thing that's happening is that you have just alternatives. So you have investment banks. You also have tech, which is bringing in a lot of like really good talent. So these firms are getting a little bit less intense because tech is much more chill. And so if you want to recruit that talent, then you need to be able to compete with them. So, but it can be so quite. I mean, you're working quite hard. Like when I was working at McKinsey, I'd work in the US. I'd work from like 8 to 8, and it's 12-hour days, pretty almost every day. And then when I was in China, that was much more intense. I was like maybe like 8:30 to like midnight pretty often or 1. So that was pretty intense. Sometimes 2. It was a pretty intense experience, I would say. Um, but it gets better as you get higher up. It also, I think, it's kind of just like you're just putting in the hours to get really good. And then usually you go on, like me, I went on and started my own company. So definitely a good investment, but it is relatively intense.
Got it. And in your opinion, would you recommend an MBA or a master's in finance? I guess the question is to break into consulting or what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think for consulting, definitely an MBA, not a master's in finance. Not many people go from master's in finance to consulting. Um, I don't, for banking, I think either could potentially work. Tripti, do you have a thought on this? I know
Yeah.
you're,
Yeah, I mean, I actually face this question very often. And besides the fact that an MBA needs a solid amount of work experience, I mean, if I had to just negate that conversation entirely, what I would say is that, take a step back and kind of figure out what are the gaps, what are the skills that you're seeking to build. If you are someone who's looking for getting your hands dirty, like, building subject matter expertise, what you want is a master's in finance or a master's in quant finance. You want to be able to build the core skills where you are actually being identified as a subject matter expert and you still get to do the dirty work. You still enjoy doing the actual work. But if you are somebody who's like, well, I don't really want to be doing core finance per se. I instead want to be leading the P&L. I want to be making more decisions on the strategy front, on the revenue front. Then a general management degree would make more sense where you're leading a finance team, where you're doing financial consulting, but you're not necessarily drawing up the models and working on those models and working on the M&A sheets and things like that. So you take a step back and be objective when you answer for yourself, what are the skills that I'm seeking? And I think that should be where the journey should begin for you into either or. All right. Next question from Siddhant, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, Stephen. I don't want you to have to like go over. What is the ideal skill set required for strategy consulting? If you could give three of them, let's just limit it to three.
Yeah, I think structured thinking, the ability to connect with others, and uh, something around like perseverance or hard work. Like, essentially you need to be able to think in a structured way. You need to be able to communicate effectively, usually hopefully building connections with people that you're working with. And then you do need to be able to just persist at problems for a long time.
Got it. Okay. And typically, when we look at companies sponsoring MBAs, do they do that on an average of 3 years work X, or would they expect you to work longer if they have to sponsor your MBA?
No, yeah, totally. Usually it's like 2 years. And a lot of the times, if you're an undergrad, you should also think about like 2+2 programs at some of these business schools as well. So you can get in hopefully your senior year and then work for a couple of years and then get sponsored. But yeah, very common, I would say,
Yeah.
for 3 years OPT.
But if you look at the average work experience of for an M7 class cohort, it's like 5 to 7 years. So there is that balance that you're going to have to look at, and you'll have to be like super impactful are at an MBB to be able to get them to sponsor you after 2 years, and at a solid M7 MBA specifically if you want to get in. Okay, are the departments in IB that aren't M&A easier to get into?
Yeah, like the short answer is yes, but it's like kind of on the margin. Like, um, when you're applying to say Goldman Sachs, you're applying in general to investment banking, but then you're often indicating which group you're excited by. And so if you're interested in like restructuring is like the hardest one to get into. So if you're interested in restructuring, that's slightly harder than let's say like maybe some other M&A or like debt financing, et cetera. Like so the there is it's really firm by firm. And so I would say like if you're interested in investment banking, just start there. And then you need to go way deeper into each firm to know like which group is hiring, how much they're hiring. Like, do you want to do tech, M&A? Okay, then you have to like then Morgan Stanley's gonna be the best, and that's gonna be the Bay. Like, that's the type of thing. It's like very niche knowledge. And so there's gonna be differences between the groups, but it's not so different. And you should just pick something that you're kind of excited by, I think, in general, because it's hard to get into no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Stephen, I completely agree with you. Sometimes we just try to game the system so hard, we forget to
Yeah.
focus on what where our true strengths lie. And we
Totally.
have to kind of align some of these decisions to our strengths, right?
Totally.
All right. Is recruiting for life sciences or pharma consulting kind of easier than doing strategy or management in terms for like acceptance rate, but also like the recruiting process?
It is a little easier. It is a little easier than let's say MBB. Not that much easier, but certainly if you have a strong kind of biopharma background, you'd be more likely to get those roles than a management consulting. So it is a little easier if you kind of hold everything constant, but it's still quite difficult.
Yeah. Okay. And would you recommend rushing for a business frat in the undergrad year?
Yeah, so the advice I'd give there is student clubs do matter quite a bit. Actually, as we work with more students, I've noticed that they matter more and matter more than I thought. Particularly if you're at a semi-target or non-target. Whether or not you should run for a rush or business frat is really dependent on each school. Will have a few finance or consulting clubs that are where most of the people who get the offers come from. So it could be business frat, it could be something else, depends on the school. In general, being involved in like these business communities do help though, because they give you exposure to people who have gone through the process and usually gotten the offer. So like without knowing exactly the business frat, I'd say yes, but it depends a little bit on each school, which is like the right club, which then like sends students to these firms.
Got it. Okay. And now with 30 seconds on the clock, quick advice on how to build a good network. And would you recommend a book for the same?
Um, yeah, I think Case Secrets is pretty good for but there's a bunch of cases. I would just there's like they're all pretty much the same. So if you can just look around there. And then network wise, I think there's a lot there of like you want to pick the pond to swim in first. That's the most important. So where you go to school, what clubs you're a part of, that's going to matter more than anything. And then secondary, it's like you can be proactive in terms of who you reach out to. And I think building the skill set of being able to reach out and build your network on your own is a really powerful skill set as well.
Yeah. And like you said, walk into those open doors, but also look for the side doors.
For
That was a
sure.
good one.
For sure.
All right. On that note, we have come to an end of the session. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
I know you were on campus yesterday. I think you were attending the ceremony at Harvard yesterday. I saw something on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I was just at commencement. I volunteered as part of the Alumni
Oh, good.
Association. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Right. And thank you for sharing your email address. So that's how you can get in touch with Stephen. He's also super active on LinkedIn and he does post
Oh,
out
yeah.
some really fun content at times. So go ahead and follow him on LinkedIn, send him a message. I'm sure he'll answer your questions. And let us know if you like the session. You can also leave a ladder career as a review, and that'll be fun as well. Stephen, thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. And thank you
Good.
everyone for joining us today on a Saturday evening. We appreciate it.
Staying up. Oh my God, you're such a superstar. I really appreciate it.